Okay, I think we all know what climate adaptation is. It's basically adjusting to things that are already happening in terms of climate change impacts, and required adjustments for managing the changes. So managing the unavoidable is generally what is described as climate adaptation. And adaptations tend to be often very incremental. So something is happening now. Let's say you are sitting in a city like Mumbai, which is flooding more. Then you build certain structures to manage the water without thinking longer term what may be needed in terms of larger systemic changes in terms of development, drainage systems, and dealing with extreme rainfall rates that are increasing, frequency, duration, intensity, etc. So there is a concept of going from incremental adaptation cycles to transformational adaptation cycles. It sounds kind of fancy phraseology, but actually it can be important in terms of planning a pathway, decision-based pathway of climate adaptation, rather than responding to something that's happening in that context without having a long-term strategy, for example. So this schematic from this paper shows how it would work when the connections between them. So incremental adaptation cycle goes like this. You have a problem. Structuring and establishing the incremental adaptation arena is a step. Developing the incremental adaptation agenda, vision, and pathways, and implementing incremental adaptation actions leading to evaluating, monitoring, and learning. But then you have to jump out of it and also feed back to the transformational adaptation cycle. So there you would go problem structuring, establishing the transformation adaptation arena instead of the incremental adaptation arena, developing the transformation adaptation agenda, vision, and pathway, and implementing transformation agenda actions, evaluating, monitoring, and learning, and then feeding into this incremental adaptation cycle. So of course this also goes into feeding back to problem structuring and establishing transformation adaptation arena. In general, all global warming is local, so nobody is living in global mean temperature, global mean sea level, and so on. So all impacts are very region specific, location specific. So adaptations will also be very region local specific, and often you can look for transferable solutions. Can you do something here and develop a typology that can be used elsewhere for adaptation in a similar scenario? Then you have to worry about cultural barriers, governance barriers, knowledge barriers, financial barriers, and so on. All those have to be dealt with, but the pathways thinking of adaptation instead of this incremental thinking is phrased like this: pathways thinking in the sustainable development domain to consider the implications of path dependency, interactions between adaptation plans, vested interests who would be supporting or opposing adaptation plans, and global change itself, which will keep changing its impacts on the local communities and systems like forests or biodiversity, fisheries, agriculture, and urban environments, and so on. And also situations where values, interests, or institutions constrain social responses to climate change, So obviously adaptation and required changes would involve some kind of a behavioral change, economic change, livelihood changes, crop rotation pattern changes, crop selection changes, and so on. So every time there is such a change involved, there are going to be barriers of various sorts. So this paper points out a few other things. It's a review paper, and it reviewed all the publications on adaptation pathways. Analysis of case studies on adaptation pathways development showed 3 clusters of approaches: performance threshold oriented, multi-stakeholder oriented and transformation oriented approaches. The paper provides some examples of each, remembering that adaptation is very case study kind of thing, because it's always in response to something at a location, and each location will have a different set of climate change impacts to deal with. Could be health, could be agriculture, could be transportation, and so on. So case study approach is always inevitable for adaptation pathways, and then how to learn from them is something that this paper provides, as we'll see in a minute. These broadly correspond to three desired outcomes of pathways development. How to develop the adaptation pathways themselves: meeting short and long-term adaptation needs, promoting collaborative learning, adaptive planning, and adaptive capacity. So do you have the economic wherewithal and other governance institutional structures to actually be able to adapt even after learning what is needed? Accounting for complexity and long-term change, including a potential need for transformation. So how to change systems, how to change things at a systemic level. Okay, so the first paper then goes back and provides a summary of adaptation context, status of adaptation practice, and key issues for 5 case studies. I'll only read the top 2 just to get a sense, and these are done by the authors drawing on their knowledge and experiences in these contexts. So let's look at 2 case studies. Local governments in the US, the adaptation context was lack of national leadership and policy framework to provide institutional coordination across sectors. So the way federal government responds to climate change, climate adaptation needs, etc., can be dependent on who's the president, who has the majority in Congress, and so on. So states can then take on their own pathways to dealing with the local impacts, especially California, New York, some of the progressive states, for example. So that's the context, with the absence of effective financing mechanisms and limited stakeholder participation being the context for adaptation as well. Status of adaptation practice to date: cities and local governments are emerging as centers of action for climate change planning. So this happens again with cities in like Chicago or New York or San Francisco, LA, and so on. Currently in the domain of early adopters, so they are responding before the central government does something. Local champions, extreme events, and participation in national and international networks of organizations are promoting action at that level. So the key issues there are little evidence of reform of social issues relating to resource access and opportunity, broader structural concerns associated with the urban design addressed in local planning. So these are done, they are progressive, they are early adopters, but they are still lacking on the details of certain issues on the transformational change that may be still needed. Looking at another example, coastal local governments in Australia in terms of the case study, and the adaptation contexts are coastal ecosystems and built infrastructure are at increasing threat of inundation due to sea level rise, storm surge, and flooding. Capacity and budget constrained local governments are responsible for making choices between protection and retreat of private assets and ecosystems. So this is a big change. If you have to move away from the coasts, and people love living near the coast, then they may want to take a wait and see attitude instead of being proactive about retreating before dangerous levels of sea level are reached, and so on. Higher levels of government are providing little leadership in this context. Status of adaptation practice to date: many councils have undertaken vulnerability assessments and evaluated adaptation options. Few councils have taken action using land use planning systems, largely limit legal liability and protect public assets. Thirdly, responses have been incremental and focused on proximate causes, which means what is happening locally and now, instead of what will happen in 10 years and how the signal may arrive from somewhere else. For example, if you're managing a fisheries here, you only look at warming and acidification in this region, whereas the signals are coming from elsewhere already on decadal, multi-decadal timescales in terms of pressures on breeding, larvae survival, recruitment, and so on and so forth. So there are many examples where proximate causes can be problematic in incremental adaptation being a maladaptation over time, for example. Adaptation action here, key issues. Adaptation action is limited and hampered by the non-binding nature of statewide policies, which are ambiguous in their intent and provide little guidance for determining coastal hazard zones, weighting climatic and non-climatic risks, clarifying liability and compensation issues, and defining roles and responsibilities. So this just tells you what challenges one faces even when there is knowledge about adaptation actions needed in response to what's happening locally and now, right? So this talks about current classic conceptualization of adaptation pathways as a series of adaptive learning decision cycles over time. So in the top left, this comes from Willows and Connell paper and Hasnut et al. With their decision lifetimes. So in the top right, the sum of lead and consequences of times, whereas some chains of decisions lead to maladaptive outcomes over time. So if you think about pathways here, but there may be other alternatives that are adaptive, as we see here. From the perspective of the current decision point at the left, a currently satisfactory pathway can be plotted through the future with the strongest colors here, but this may be revisited after each decision point, and that can lead to avoiding maladaptive space. If you're on the wrong track, use the cycle of feedbacks to come back and stay within the adaptive space. So the decision cycles go like this: reassess or assess climate affected decisions and overall goals, look at potential impacts within decision lifetime, how many years you're planning. Adaptation options and risk minimization should be getting a feedback from this potential impacts at decision lifetime, which should then feed back to select preferred option, implement and monitor, and then reassess climate affected decisions and overall goals. Okay, in the decision cycle context, there is a decision lifetime, and you are looking again at the decision cycle here. Here you are taking into account the lead time, so you are coming from framing, scoping, and resources and resourcing to look at research, consultations, and revisions feeding into decision cycles, and then taking into account community perception and reaction, special interests, government, regulations, and funding, and then look at the consequence time, and then have a loop that works. So iterative decision cycles basically then allow you to start with the decision cycle that has to be done now, but then you have a pathway for this adaptation, you reassess, and then you avoid the pathways that lead to maladaptive spaces in both sense. Obviously it's very schematic, but you can understand how such a process would require monitoring, validation, reporting, etc., to stay within the adaptive space and avoid maladaptive spaces and so on. So the paper also looks at the summary of 7 analytical framings of adaptation. I don't know if I'll read all the details, so focus and emphasis will depend on the framing itself. They can be livelihoods based, so in this approach emphasizes the importance of existing social conditions, individual perceptions, local experiences, and informational institutions as critical aspects for determining how communities cope with current climate conditions as a starting point for developing appropriate adaptation responses. So you want to take what's happening now and consider where we need to go into the future. Impact analytical approach looks at the IPCC views as a single or few decisions that are taken on the basis of projected future impacts, where it is assumed impacts and decisions can be singled out and formally quantified and evaluated using multi-criteria and so on. So that's relying on future projections with all their uncertainties and what-if scenarios and so on. Institution analytic framing emphasizes the need for horizontal integration of policy to mainstream climate change adaptation considerations into existing policy processes. So without reading the others, decision making under uncertainty, social and institutional processes for framing, multi-level governance for framing, and social learning and adaptive management. Okay, so it provides one decision making actors. So this provides the schematic of looking at classic adaptation pathways, required transformative cycles, and then pathway dependencies of these adaptive space and maladaptive space, as we already looked at, and looking at change in biophysical variables over time. Okay, with institutional preparedness being considered, and also looking at adaptive landscape affected by changing climate, but also other drivers and other actors' responses. So climate change is happening in the background. You are making some decisions, and you are trying to stay in the adaptive space and trying to avoid maladaptive space, making decisions and re-evaluating them, reassessing them, and so on, trying to head towards transformative cycles, which gives you long-term adaptations. But you also have climate change throwing up surprises and other drivers, like maybe global supply chains, your dependency on imports of certain materials or technologies, knowledge, etc. And there are actors who may change the game along the way, right? Political decisions, socio-political decisions, and so on. So typically you start with the current decision points and have to consider all these aspects. So reading the caption, one decision-making actor's adaptation pathways through an adaptive landscape, building on the metaphor of figure 1 that we had looked at here, where the boundaries between adaptive and maladaptive responses are changing over time due to biophysical changes as climate is changing along the way, but also due to changes in social and institutional context, election cycles, for example, or other impacts that affect socioeconomics, demographics, etc., including the actions of other decision makers who may perceive different adaptation pathways. So you may set on some pathway starting from the current decision point, but along the way a different government or different set of players may come along and decide that this is not the most safest way, and so on. Circle arrows represent decision points. Dark blue arrows represent pathways that are contemporaneously adaptive. Gray arrows lead to maladaptive dead ends. And dashed blue arrows represent more or less transformative pathway segments, and the green arrows show antecedent pathways prior to the current decision cycles here, where you are coming to the decision point with the previous decisions that are already made. So A, faced by the decision maker of concern, here and here. Boxes A to D highlight differences from figure 1 that are discussed in the text that you can read up. So you can see how many aspects are involved in even considering the past and the decisions made already, and the institutional preparedness for the decisions that were made, and then the pathways you will select and the decision cycles you have to keep on revisiting and reassessing to stay in this pathway, and all the time hoping to hit the transformational change that may be needed. So the review paper from 2021 again looks at all the adaptive pathway research approaches and looks at the propositions and outcomes in the learning framework on adaptation pathways development. So this is kind of a summary in some sense. Adaptation pathways development outcomes involve meet short and long-term adaptation needs. Outcome 2 would be promote collaborations, collaborative learnings, adaptive planning, and adaptive capacity. And outcome 3 focuses on accounting for complexity and long-term change, including a potential need for transformation. So the word transformation, you can take it as systemic change, whether it's agricultural system, fisheries system, urban system, transportation system, energy system, and so on and so forth. Okay, so here are the various things under each outcomes. Target a specific decision or decision maker for framing adaptation pathways development. Sequence actions considering future uncertainty. Communicate pathways visually for including all the stakeholders. Under this outcome 2, monitor and evaluate to learn and inform implementation, which is where decision-based pathways come from, decision-focused pathways. Engage stakeholders with different values, goals, and knowledge. Otherwise, co-developing becomes very important. Otherwise, implementation faces all sorts of barriers. Address both symptoms and root causes of vulnerability, which is very important to make sure that adaptations actually are equitable and just, as well as protecting people and guardrailing against disasters. Address adaptation as an integral component of sustainable development. This is what is needed for it to be transformational in the long term. Okay, so it's kind of a longish summary and still very important to consider all these points. Very brief, of course, even though it's 20 minutes long, but there are some very important papers that you can read to follow up on the details, and look always at case studies where these principles are tested, and then you can see whether staying in the adaptive space, avoiding maladaptation works, or there are disaster cases like Easter Island and so on, where lack of action or lack of adaptation plans, incremental or transformational, may have ended up in disasters. Okay, case studies, case studies, case studies, always important.